Good afternoon. We are delighted to welcome in our midst Dr. Arvind Subramanian. Arvind is Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, has been since 2014, prior to which he was a Dennis Weatherstone Senior Fellow at Peterson Institute and Senior Fellow at the Center for Global Development. Prior to that, Arvind was an economist with IMF and is widely renowned for being a very thoughtful scholar on India and China and the emerging world. He's widely published in all the major economics and policy journals. Arvind has a DPhil and an MPhil from the University of Oxford, economics honors from St. Stephen's, but I guess his most important degree is he's a graduate of our school, PGP batch of 1981. And I notice in the audience several of our seniors, some of whom have celebrated their 50th year of graduation here, and some others who are batches around Arvind, and I think we are all very proud of you and welcome you back here. Arvind will be talking with us today on the subject, the surprise that is the Indian economy. And in true IIMA style, he has said he will speak for a little while, 30, 40 minutes we've requested him. And then he would love to engage in discussions, Q&A. So without further ado, Arvind, please welcome.
Professor Ashish Nanda, Professor Basant, Professor D'Souza, all of you in the audience, distinguished guests. I see some, at least one old face I remember from here, Professor Mote, who it's lovely to see you here, sir, in our midst. I am obviously delighted to be here back in on campus. I am coming here for the first time after 36 years. It brings back great memories. I mean, just to enter the LKP Plaza is something that's quite a thrilling experience. Of course, one carries with one lots of memories of this place. Not all good, some mostly good, but some also, which may be more due to the fact that we were also unformed and raw in those days. But it's really wonderful to be back. And I'm very grateful to Professor Nanda and Professor Chinmay Tambe also, who was instrumental in my coming here. I'm supposed to be the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, which I am. I also am, by aptitude and vocation and kind of passion, an economist and a researcher. And so today what I thought I'd do is share some of the findings from the latest piece of output that my team and I, sitting in the Ministry of Finance, have produced. So if I were to ask you, what does the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India do? I'm sure many of you will have notions about what he does. Probably many of you think he does nothing at all. Probably some of you think that he hangs around somewhere in Delhi and does some things. But I have to tell you, it's actually really a very, very exciting job. And one of the most exciting things, in fact, the only, I think, requirement of a Chief Economic Advisor, the actual requirement, is to produce this document every year called the Economic Survey of India. This is a document that is tabled to Parliament the day before the budget, immediately the day before the budget. So people anticipate this document because they think it's going to give a sense for what the vision of the government is, what the priorities are, and maybe even what the budget next day might include in it. In some ways, the effectiveness of an economic advisor is judged by the correlation between the survey and the budget. So if the budget completely ignores the survey, then they know this is a guy who's, off on his own doing things and the government doesn't listen to him. Or if there's a good correlation, they draw the inference that actually he's a very influential guy. I think both are probably not right. The truth lies somewhere in between. But just producing this document is an enormously inspiring task for at least one reason. I was, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, in Srinagar presenting this survey. So one of the things I like to do is to write the survey and then to go out, especially to go and meet young people to give them a sense of what the Indian economy is doing. So I was in Srinagar 2 years ago presenting the survey when the finance minister of Jammu and Kashmir, his name is Dr. Hasib Drabu, he was introducing me and he turned to me and said, do you know who tabled the first economic survey of India in Parliament? And I was stumped. Of course, being the cheeky guy that I was, I had to meet the President of India a few months later, who is a veteran of the finance ministry, and a veteran of many, many governments, the ultimate survivor, someone might call him. And I asked him this question, do you know who tabled the first economic survey to Parliament? He didn't know, so I felt slightly better when I realized I didn't know either. And the answer to that question is the first economic survey was tabled by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. And just that thought makes my hair stand on end that you're part of this amazing tradition that goes back to Pandit Nehru. I think it was during the Indo-China war. There was no finance minister, and the prime minister was, I think, deputing as the finance. The prime minister was acting as finance minister. So I think he tabled this document in Parliament. So it's a big responsibility. It's something that it's traditionally been seen to be somewhat of a dry document because, economics is up to a point a dry, boring discipline, but we have to make it come alive, and let's see whether I can make it come alive for you today. So there's a lot in the survey, and I would urge all of you to read it. Keep it by your bedside and kind of a chapter a day to go to sleep. But what I'm going to do today is to tell you some of the more interesting and exciting things that we found in the course of the survey. So how does the Indian economy surprise? I hope all of this will be a surprise to you because it was a surprise to me, even for someone like me who's been kind of studying the Indian economy for some time. So what should an economic survey aspire to? And this is something that I've thought about a lot, and I really think that this is a message I'd like to transmit to all of you as well, because it has wider appeal than for just economists alone. This is a famous quote of John Maynard Keynes, probably the greatest economist in the last 200 years. He was asked, what is the quality of a good economist? And he made the following very astute observation. He said, actually, if you think about it, compared to mathematics or science, economics is not very demanding in terms of, a discipline. I think scientists and mathematicians are, so much smarter than economists. I still remember Dr. Mote's class, and, just to see him there, you felt, wow, he knows so much more and will always know so much more than I will, having that fine intellectual ability that mathematicians have. But Keynes said the paradox is that even though economics is not a very demanding discipline, actually you have very few good economists. That's the puzzle. And so from there he went on to say, what are the qualities of a good economist? And I've just transposed that to what a good economic survey should contain. It must possess a rare combination of gifts. It must draw upon, remember he was talking about economists, so you can substitute the it with the he or she, see how gender biased I am. He must draw upon mathematics, history, statesmanship and philosophy in some degree, so multifaceted. He must understand symbols and speak in words, so that he must be good with mathematics and with writing. He must study the present in the light of the past for the purposes of the future. he must be purposeful and disinterested in a simultaneous mood. So, I mean, it's a bit like the Bhagavad Gita, you know, you engage but also disengage completely. Its authors as aloof and incorruptible as artists, you must have that distance, and yet sometimes as near to earth as grubby politicians, right? You know, so you must be able to kind of engage fully, be fully part of the hurly-burly of policy making, yet be able to distance yourself and say, you know, I want to be objective, dispassionate, and so on. So I think this is actually the qualifications for a good economist. It is, I would argue, also the qualifications for all of you who will go on to, you know, become successful managers and entrepreneurs and so on. It reminds me, you know, when I presented this as what a survey must contain, I could see that I was not getting much traction with the audience. So I said, this has actually been translated into more accessible words by Amitabh Bachchan, the great philosopher. In one of his movies, he said, "Is movie mein tragedy hai, comedy hai, naach hai, gana hai, dishum dishum bhi hai." I think a survey should have everything like that, and that's what, you know, we aspire to do in the economic survey. So this year's economic survey has three parts. One is what we call the perspective, which is all the kind of big picture things. The second is what we call the proximate. I mean, what is happening in the short run? Those are the issues that we dealt with there. And I think two important issues that we discussed. One is, of course, demonetization, on which, of course, you're forbidden to ask questions in the Q&A session. And the second one, of course, is what we call the twin balance sheet problem, the whole what should we do about the banking system, two topics. And then we call the persistent is the long run. What are the interesting issues for India in the long run? And there I'm going to talk about one or two. One idea from that which has also gained a lot of traction, it's something called universal basic income. I mean, can we give all poor Indians a minimum basic living? What are the pros and cons? It's an issue we discuss. It's, again, been discussed a lot in the press after the economic survey came out. But I'm not going to go into any of these. I'm going to tell you what is very surprising about India. So I'm going to tell you 8 surprising things about India, which you may not know about. Number one, and the inspiration for this chapter is Professor Chinmay Tambe, who's one of the bright young professors here at IIM Ahmedabad. He's done some great work on migration, and you know, he helped us, and drawing from his work, we got hold of some fantastic data. I mean, this data has never been used before from the railways. So we said, we have data now on every passenger who moved from every station to every other station every day for the last 15 years. Think of what the data requirements there are. The Minister of Railways, who's a good friend, was very kind to share this data. And what we found was that, you know, Chinmay's finding is that actually there's a lot more migration in India than you think. What we found using this, so the metric we used was, what is the, you know, net flow of people between 2 states or 2 districts on an annual basis in the unreserved category, because we wanted to find what is the migration for, I mean, work movement related to work. And so we looked at the unreserved who are more likely to move for work. And what we discovered was that when Chinmay says, you know, there's a lot more than you think, I think the fresh piece of research said it's even greater than what Chinmay thinks, actually. You know, so I think his estimate was something like 4 to 5 to 6 million Indians move for work every year. Our estimate was actually closer to 8 to 9 millions a year. And that's a lot. Because, you know, I studied China as well. And to me, what has always struck me about China, one statistic is that on New Year's Day in China, about 300 million people board the train to go back to their village. It's astounding, 25% of the workforce or more. And the sense, the perception always was, oh, China is very mobile in terms of people, but India isn't. And it turns out that that's actually not fully true, because there's a lot of churn in India as well. And the calculation, and those are the, you know, satellite-based charts of where the kind of back and forth movements are. You find that 8 to 9 million people move in India, much more than people ever thought of. So this is kind of a surprising fact, number one. And this, by the way, has a lot of implications, which I'm going to touch upon at the end, for what it means in terms of disparities between states in India in terms of achieving levels of development. So this was the surprising fact, number one, India on the move and churning. The second fact is, you see, the caricature of India is this, essentially that we are a country where there are so many barriers to the movement of goods within India that people had given up on India. This is the caricature of India at these crossings, border crossings. You have a line of trucks waiting, and the guy there obviously is extorting, he's corrupt, he's lazy, and therefore the flow of goods within India is actually not very great. And by the way, that's a caricature as recent as even a few months ago. I think this is, the Economist had a picture of India showing something like this. It turns out that because we had access to data from the indirect tax people, we actually have extremely detailed data. Essentially every tax transaction of every firm in India, again for the last 6-7 years, we were able to use that from the tax data to extract data on the flow of goods between states. And what you find is that trade within India, I can move, right? As a share of GDP, which is one measure of trade in India, is about 55-56%, and it's much greater than many other large countries like Indonesia, Canada, European Union, and not so far off from others as well. So the caricature that India is somehow closed internally is actually not true. It's something, again, I didn't know. I thought actually because of all these border barriers between states, the octroi duties, the multiple forms, the multiple registrations, we thought this would, India was very close. It turns out that that's just not the case. And in fact, at a time when the world is becoming so anxious about, the movement of goods across borders, it's very heartening to know that at least within India, the movement of goods within our borders is actually quite good. And I've been involved in the GST discussions on the goods and services tax. It turns out that this is actually also very encouraging because this is happening at a time when we're trying to create one market, one tax, one India via the goods and services tax. So the fact that trade flows within India are so good means, I think it bodes very, very well for India that we're a kind of very dynamic nation trading a lot with each other, within ourselves. So that's a second very surprising fact. But to me, this was the most surprising fact, which, I study a lot of trade, and trade is one of my, interests. And the view has always been with justification that China is a more open economy than India. And the way we measure openness is to measure how much a country exports and imports as a share of its GDP. And it turns out that China, it is true, it was trading much greater than, remember, again, the caricature India is India, socialist, closed, doesn't do trade, ridden with controls at the borders, corrupt administration, etc., etc. And it has been true for the last 25, 30 years that China's trade has been much greater than India's. But lo and behold, after the global financial crisis, we have overtaken China as a nation that trades much more. And this came as a complete shock to me because you think of China as, the classic country that has grown very rapidly on the basis of trade. It turns out that after the global financial crisis, trade in China plummeted. It's come down enormously, whereas trade in India has been on a steady rise. So maybe at the end of the day, India is the tortoise and China is the hare, and maybe in some long marathon, we're going to come out ahead, and that seems to be the case so far. So the fact that India is more open than China was something that I just did not know before I embarked upon this survey. So that's a surprise number 3 or 4, or if you're counting. The other interesting thing we did in this survey was to get satellite data to try and map urban density. So this is a map based on satellite data of China, of Bangalore, or Bengaluru as a urban agglomeration. The red bits are the built-up bits, and the green bits are the non-built-up bits. So what did we do with this data, this source of big data? What we said was, can we approximate what is the potential for property tax collection in Bangalore? And we did that. Of course, you have to use machine learning techniques. We have a very bright youngster called Parth in my office, who's a whiz with these things. And then when he did this very carefully, we did this for Bangalore and we did this for Jaipur as well, we discovered that these two cities are collecting about 5 to 15% of the taxes that they should be collecting. And this is probably a conservative estimate of the under collection. So what it shows is that we can use these new sources of data and technology actually to improve property tax collection in our cities, because it's very important, because we also find in the survey that those cities that collect more taxes and actually spend more do in fact end up providing better services to their residents. So it's again a very exciting possibility that gets thrown up by the fact of being able to use new data and so on. Why, of course, cities don't utilize this potential, why they undercollect, is of course a very interesting political economy question that I think is worth thinking about going forward. Then, okay, so there's a background to this chart. So when we were thinking about what we should be doing in terms of what are the topics for the survey we should be covering, in the last 1 year, this concept of a universal basic income, i.e. to provide all citizens with a basic income, a basic standard of living, has been gaining a lot of ground both within India and internationally as well. Switzerland had a referendum on this. It was rejected. Finland is experimenting with this. The United Kingdom is experimenting with it. And maybe it'll resonate more with you. One of these Silicon Valley gurus, is it Peter Thiel or Mark Andreessen, or one of these guys, also has come out saying that universal basic income is a must. And they say in the advanced economies, it's going to become very important, because if robots replace people for jobs, people won't have jobs, and therefore, we may have to de-link income from employment, and so that's a reason to have universal basic income. Of course, in India, the debate is, we need this because there are lots of very poor people. So the question is this or is this not a good idea? And so we decided we'd work on this. And then it happened that Professor Tridip Surud, I don't know whether he's here or not, from the ashram, the Gandhi ashram here, he invited me to give a talk on what Mahatma Gandhi taught about poverty. And then it struck me, as I was preparing for that the notion, the concept of a universal basic income is something that would be very interesting to discuss from a Gandhian perspective. Because on the one hand, Gandhiji had this amazing ability to kind of encapsulate the universal human conscience and to say that, we have to wipe every tear from every eye. So the universal basic income offered a very accelerated way. You just have to transfer money to people and they get lifted out of poverty. But then a colleague of mine sent me a quote from Mahatma Gandhi, when he, in 1924, how he was completely against giving money away to people without them having to do anything. So Gandhiji was a real moralist as well. So I decided that, so I came and gave a talk at the ashram as, what would Mahatma Gandhi have thought about universal basic income. So the title of this chapter is in the survey is called Universal Basic Income, a conversation with and within the Mahatma. Clearly, Gandhiji would have had this torment on this because he was on both sides of the argument. But one of the main attractions of this idea of universal basic income is that today the government already provides a lot of, spends a lot on social programs and on subsidies. And it is generally thought that these programs are not very, very effective in reaching the target audience, namely the poor. I think, I don't know whether you remember, you're too young, many of you, to remember this, but Rajiv Gandhi famously said that for every 1 rupee that the Indian government spends, only 9 or 10 paise reaches the poor. I am sure he was making it up, but it had a certain resonance because we all think of government as being very wasteful, inefficient, and so on. So we actually got data on about 7 or 8 of the major social programs, and we tried to map, where all this money was being spent. So on the left-hand side shows where the poor live in India. So the more red the district, the poorer it is. There's many more poor people. And then on the right-hand side, using this data, we said, what is the shortfall of money going to that district, same district in India? It turns out, you can see that the color pattern is very similar. So in a sense, the greater the poverty, the greater the inadequacy of the spending that goes to that place, which is, of course, shows that government programs are not very effective at targeting. And so the interesting thing is that this is intrinsic to the way government has designed its programs. It is not necessarily because Indian government is more inefficient or the state governments are more inefficient. It is just that those state governments that are more efficient will use this money more effectively, and because they're more efficient, they by definition will have fewer poor people. So almost it's a feature built into the system that you're not going to achieve very good targeting in terms of reaching those who most deserve this. So we showed this evidence. We've actually presented it to the highest circles, and the advantage of the universal basic income is that it allows you to overcome this, because essentially someone sitting somewhere in a state capital or Delhi basically has to transfer money to people's bank accounts or to their mobile phones, or when all this technology becomes up to date. So it offers a very interesting way of overcoming the problem of weak targeting of government spending. So and of course we discussed the pros and cons of this. One reason why this idea has to be discussed very carefully is that, and this is why another reason why Gandhiji would have been against it, is that in India it's very difficult, it's very easy to introduce a new program, but it's very difficult to withdraw existing programs. And the costs of this program are big enough that it cannot be an add-on to all existing programs, because the government would not be able to afford it. The government finances would go bust. And so the trick or the challenge going forward is, if this is considered a good idea, if this is considered a good way of eliminating poverty and providing people with a minimum level that they can live with dignity and be entrepreneurial and so on, then how can we implement it in a way that is sustainable and that the government can afford? So in fact, after the survey, again, this idea has got a lot of attention both nationally and internationally, and kind of the world is waiting to see how India is going to follow up on this. So this is another very exciting new finding from the economic survey. Now, here I'm going to test your stamina and patience. So, am I boring you? Are you awake after? Yes? Louder? Okay, good. Okay, good. So one of the really interesting things about, one of my areas of research is studying economic growth around the world. Now, what you find around the world is that from about 1750 or so, I mean, I'm making the number up, plus or minus 5, 10, 15 years, doesn't matter. What you find is that after the Industrial Revolution, West Europe and the United States took off in terms of the standards of living, and all of what is now called the developing world got left behind. That process is called divergence, because standards of living diverged between the rich and the poor countries. Now, very interestingly, in the last 25, 30 years, that phenomenon is being reversed. I.e., for the first time in about 200 years, we are seeing that finally the poorer countries like China, India, the East Asians, parts of Africa, parts of Latin America, parts of Central Europe are catching up with the advanced countries. We call that process of catching up convergence, because they're converging to the standard of living, and the opposite process we call divergence. So, in the world, essentially, trust me when I say that if that line is downward sloping, we are seeing a process of convergence. What it essentially says is that the poorer you are, the faster you grow subsequently, and that's what allows you to catch up. So this is countries across the world, and you find that in the last 25, 30 years, there's good news for humanity. The poorer countries. So I actually call this the golden age for. So when the advanced countries are moaning about, oh, what is going to happen to us, etc., I say actually this is the golden age for developing countries, because in the last 25, 30 years is when we've seen the most rapid improvement in living standards and so on. And this captures that. This captures the same thing within China. Within China, the poorer provinces have started catching up with the richer provinces. So there too, within China, we're seeing a process of equalization, and inequalities amongst regions are actually coming down. But what do we see in India? Exactly the opposite. In the last 15 years, poorer states have been growing on average slower than the richer states. So what that means is that if a state, call it X, any state that I name will get me into trouble. So let's say state number X, it started off in 2000 poorer than a richer state. You would expect it to grow faster, but in fact it's growing slower. What this means is that disparities within India are actually increasing. And this is in sharp contrast to what is happening everywhere in the world. And this, I think, is, we wrote an op-ed based on this recently. To me, it's one of the deepest puzzles about India. Why is it that, and it's a bigger puzzle for another reason. It's a bigger puzzle because, within India, people are moving, trade is happening, and all these things, more trade, more people moving, means that actually the opposite should happen. Because, if Gujarat is growing faster than Orissa, people will come from Orissa to Gujarat, so that you will see that people from Orissa start becoming richer and partaking of what's happening in Gujarat. But that's not happening enough in India, and this is kind of a deep, deep puzzle, which I was certainly very surprised by when I saw this in the data. We all know about the demographic dividend. I also thought I knew something about the demographic dividend. It turns out that there's something. Do people know what the demographic dividend is? Essentially that, all countries go through a stage where, how many young people there are in the population, it rises and then it falls over time. So that, in the rising phase is when you get all the economic dynamism. In the declining phase, you have many, many more elderly people, and so the task of looking after them. So the number of productive people to dependent people, that ratio changes over time. And that has very important implications for how economies grow. So one of the striking statistical regularities is that all the East Asian countries, South Korea, China, Indonesia, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Japan, the boom that they had after World War II coincided very strongly with this, the share of the working age to non-working age population rising very sharply. That's when they grew very rapidly. Now, India is very unusual in the sense that we are also on our demographic dividend phase when this is rising, but ours has been much gentler than these countries. So both the dividend going up is going to be gentler, and also the decline is going to be gentler. And so we have a very unusual pattern of demographic dividend. So how that's going to affect our growth is also going to be somewhat different from what happened elsewhere. Now, it turns out that within India, there's a huge difference. We are like, from a demographic point of view, we are like two Indias. We have an India which comprises Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, and West Bengal, an exception. They are like some of the advanced countries. They're like countries which have started to become older and older. Many more old people in these states than young people. And so we have one India, which is peninsular India, which resembles the advanced countries in terms of their age structure. And then we have what used to be called Bimaru India, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, Orissa, which are much more young and dynamic. So we have two Indias here. And so this is going to be a huge challenge and an opportunity, because the demographic dividend means that we are going to be very dynamic because of this, But then soon there are states in India that are going to start aging, and they will need people from the other parts of India to look after their elderly and their aging. So in a sense, we may need more migration in India just so that young demographic India of the Bimaru states actually migrates more in order to look after the aging population of some of the, the older aging states. The other thing we discovered is that this window of opportunity that we call the demographic dividend is going to, close very soon. We estimate that around 2020 is when we'll reach the peak of the demographic dividend, and after that, the growth boom from having so many young people will start declining very gradually and very soon. So what this means is that it's a kind of wake-up call to all policymakers to say, we have this window of opportunity, we have to do the most that we can. Last, I'm going to end with this because I think we'll take some questions after this. So one of the things that we have to do in our job is to deal with these ratings agencies. I mean, these ratings agencies come and say, how good is India? I mean, they literally are rating agencies. They rate us compared to other countries on a number of parameters, and then they say, they give us a grade. It's like your surprise quiz that you're going to get tomorrow. Full disclosure, I know nothing about the surprise quiz tomorrow. I'm just making it up. But I think that these rating agencies come and say, India is B minus, other countries A minus, etc., etc. Now, I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Big Short? Yeah? Or how many of you have read the book Big Short? Ah, that's very good. I think it's the best book on the global financial crisis. It's the most insightful book for a number of reasons we can talk about. But one of the things that came out from this book, of course, is that the rating agencies had a big role to play in the crisis because essentially, assets that were, in themselves, I mean, I can't use the word, pretty rubbish. Once they were packaged with other assets, they were rated as, A. And so the rating agencies were routinely rating toxic assets much better than they deserve to be. And the movie Big Short basically is about these 3-4 guys who knew what these underlying assets were worth and had the courage and the deep pockets to stick with it in the face of complete overwhelming forces on the other side. How can you differ with the ratings agencies? They are saying it's AAA. Who are you to come and say it's not that? But they waited, and in the end, they proved to be right. Right? So that's one aspect of what the rating agencies did very badly. In the economic survey, what we show is that I hope all of you got the pun. We call this poor standards because one of the biggest rating agencies is Standard & Poor's, and basically we accuse them of saying they have lousy standards for judging how good or bad countries are. And the evidence we show is that we sort of compare their rating for China, which is almost top quality, and for India, it's barely investment grade. So you see that there's a 6 or 7 level difference in the ratings given by this to India and China. But these rating agencies are meant to assess risk. And it turns out that over the period that we show here, China's growth decelerated rapidly, and the biggest risk factor that we all know precedes financial crisis is the amount of credit in the economy, and that's been growing gangbusters. I mean, the credit increase in China has grown at an unprecedentedly alarming rate. And despite that, and despite the fact that in India growth has generally gone up and credit has basically remained flat, so on a risk basis, if you looked at these two charts, you would say, wow, India is less risky than China, but in fact, the ratings agencies rate in China much higher, and also they have not changed China's ratings despite the fact that risks have gone up so much. So in the economic survey, what we say is that, don't take these guys too seriously because Standard & Poor's has pretty poor standards. I could carry on and exhaust you, but also exhaust myself. but I hope I've given you a flavor of what are the surprises of the Indian economy. I would urge the economics professors to make the survey compulsory reading in all courses, and also in non-economic courses. And thank you all for your patience in listening to me. I'll be delighted to take questions. Yeah, thank you.